If you're listening to this podcast, it means you're hungry. Hungry for change, hungry for growth, and ready to have a major breakthrough in your business. As a partner or founder in more than a dozen businesses that do more than $5 billion in revenue each year, Tony Robbins has learned from the best in the world, the Steve Winns, Mark Benioffs, and Peter Gubers, what it takes to be successful. Whether you've been in business for decades or are just getting started, it's important to get help from someone who's been there, someone who's going to coach you through it. That's why Tony is offering a free one-on-one business strategy session from one of his top business strategists, a $600 value, completely free, no strings attached. If you're listening right now, go to TonyRobbins.com/CEO and sign up for a free session with a Tony Robbins trained business strategist who's helped business owners just like you to overcome their obstacles and set them on the path to success. In a world where 96% of businesses fail after 10 years, you must know how to anticipate and how to take advantage. Take advantage of this offer today.
Hi, this is Tony Robbins with the Tony Robbins Podcast. Welcome.
And this is Mary B., Tony's sidekick to the podcast.
She's a little more than my sidekick. She's my right arm. If you've read any book I do, any audio, this is the person who's behind the scenes working with me. Thank you, Mayor.
We're excited for the guest today.
Tell them who it is.
Okay, I'm excited. Tim Ferriss. I listen to the Tim Ferriss Show, the podcast. I love it. Many of us met Timothy Ferriss in 2007 when he wrote the #1 New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller, The 4-Hour Workweek. He's since written The 4-Hour Body and The 4-Hour Chef, but he's got a new book out and comes out December 6th. Tone, tell us about Tools of Titans.
Yes, it's called The Tactics, Routines, and Habits of Billionaires, Icons, and World-Class Performers. You know, Tim has done 200 interviews on his podcast with some of the most brilliant people in the world, and he synthesized them. He wanted to take a month for himself and make sure he was using and applying the best of everything he'd learned. He wanted to create his own kind of cliff notes. And now in this one book, we get the cliff notes from the best of the best. So I'm very excited to kind of dip in and ask him first. You know, I know Tim personally. He's been a dear friend of mine for many years. And most people, when they see someone incredibly successful, they don't know what it took to get in that place. And so I want to find a little bit about what created Tim Ferriss as we know him, what makes this guy go. Also want to get into what are some of the actual tips, after we learn some of his background, that are some of the ones that stood out to him out of all 200 interviews. What are those strategies, those tools that you can apply to improve the quality of your life mentally, emotionally, physically, financially? And then finally, what are the questions that have unleashed most of his learnings, most of his success? Because we both agree questions are the answer. So let's get to it. The man I'm about to introduce is a dear friend. He's someone I respect immensely. He's somebody who walks his talk, and he's somebody that has had 90 million of his podcasts downloaded. It's extraordinary. The one and only Tim Ferriss. How you doing, Tim?
Thank you so much, guys. It's a pleasure to be here. And for those people listening, after that intro, it's all downhill from here.
Tim, it's always great to visit with you. And I've been on your show 3 times. You've been so wonderful. And I'm excited that you're going to share the best of what you've learned in this new book, Tool of the Titans, the Tactics, Routines, and Habits of Billionaires, Icons, and World-Class Performers. But before we get into the interviews and them, I want to get into you because you're such a fascinating human being. I know you as a dear friend, but you're fascinating even as a friend. I'd love it if you'd start out by maybe telling us what's the genesis of Tim Ferriss. Where does this man come from? Where does this hunger and this drive to find answers, and not just find them, but to experiment and prove that they can be replicated? Where did this all come from for you?
I think if I had to point to the origins of at least some of the habits and drives that I have, I would go back to first way back to my early childhood. I was born premature and was in the ICU for quite a long time. Still have respiratory and lung issues and scars from having blood transfusions or at least having the blood oxygenated. And I was a runt. I was a runt of the litter. I was a very, very small kid up until about 6th grade, and my parents didn't have a whole lot of money. They probably made less than 50 grand or so per year combined. But what they said was, we don't have a budget necessarily for new books. We don't have a budget necessarily for new bikes or BB guns or whatnot, but we always have a budget for books. And we would go to the local bookstore and look at the remainder table if we wanted to, my brother and I, get books. And that was really opening up the world of potential to me. And my parents made it very clear, if you study and you do well in school, you will be able to do anything that you want to do in life. That was the belief system that they set in me and my brother. And my mom always exposed us to many different things. She would take us to the beach to collect black sand with magnets. She would take us to comic book conventions. Wherever we wanted to go, she would support us and allow us then, with her enthusiasm behind it, to explore these things. She never forced us to take any piano lessons, although I did take one with a friend who did it for free. She never forced us to count to 10 in French in front of people at a dinner party or anything weird like that. We weren't forced to perform like trick ponies or anything. That's where I think the curiosity comes from. The performance aspect and the replication and all of that, I think, came a little bit later, around the age of 14 or 15, when I began very seriously to compete in wrestling. My mom had very smartly put me as a runt into kiddie wrestling because I was hyperactive, and it was really the only sport where I wouldn't get my ass kicked by everybody because it was weight class based, right? So it's the 60-pound weakling versus the other 60-pound weakling, but one of them gets to be king of the hill, or at least feel that way. And what I realized pretty quickly in wrestling is that weight cutting is a very big part of the sport. And if you get really good at weight cutting, and by my senior season, I was cutting from 178 at the time to 152 twice a week, which is very unhealthy.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's a lot of weight. And then you would rehydrate in, say, anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. And it was a very difficult practice. But to do that, and I'm not a doctor, don't play one on the internet. I'm not by any stretch recommending that. I think I still have some injuries and deficiencies because of that. But the point being, to pull that off with and still retain some competitive edge, you had to understand sodium. You had to understand potassium-sparing diuretics. You had to understand how to rehydrate, sodium, glycogen, all of these things. And I became, at that point, the human guinea pig. And I would test things in training that I could then apply to competition, and ultimately got to the national stage my senior season. But it was at that point that I started teaching my wrestling teammates how to use some of these tricks, and realized that it was replicable. It wasn't just for the kid with the bad left lung and the thermoregulation problems. And that really kicked off the obsession with physical performance enhancement. And then when I ended up going to Princeton, which is a funny story in and of itself, because my guidance school counselor told me I shouldn't even bother applying to some of these stretch schools. And Tony, you'll appreciate this.
Oh my God.
What I realized later, I was like, okay, first meeting, last meeting, thanks but no thanks. What I realized later is that people respond to incentives, and this guy's incentive was what? It was to say what percentage of his students got into their first choice college. So how do you make that as easy as possible? You lower all the kids' expectations. You make them shoot for lower schools. It was a terrible thing. But I got into Princeton. It's terrible, right? And I went to Princeton, and I started in the neuroscience department within psychology, and I realized that all of the OCD that I'd applied to physical performance could apply to mental performance, and that in fact they're one and the same. They're interrelated. It's all the same machine, and that is really where I think all of this craziness began.
Well, we're all grateful for the craziness. You know, it's not been an easy road for you. There was a stage you shared with me in college, if I remember correctly, where you're considering suicide, and you talk about suicide in this book, which is not a topic most people would talk about. Tell us a little bit about that crossroads for you and how you move from weakness to strength.
That was the darkest period for me, for sure, and it was hard to write about. It took me months to write the chapter about this, but I was in my senior year, and I'll try to keep it concise. Ultimately, there were a number of events that all happened in a short period of time, and had they been spread out, maybe I would have been able to handle it. But I wasn't getting hired, or I wasn't making it to final interviews for a job after graduation, which was the first time I'd really failed in any type of competition like that, if that makes sense. I'd always done so well in school, and I wasn't by any stretch the smartest kid at Princeton. There were many, many smarter kids, but to be completely rejected, I'm not getting a passing grade, it's a yes or no, and I was getting a no. Then a girlfriend at the time left me because I was becoming too needy and insecure due to the job stuff. Then my senior thesis advisor, and it's important to understand that at many schools, including Princeton, that the senior thesis is about 25% of your 4-year GPA. It is a huge deal. It is very heavily weighted. And my senior thesis advisor wanted me to incorporate a huge stack of original Japanese language research into my thesis. I was then at that point in the East Asian Studies department. And I realized I wasn't going to make my deadline. There was no way I was going to finish the thesis after trying to do it without any success for a while. And I went in to talk to him. Now, simultaneously with this, I got a surprise job offer from Berlitz because I was interviewing one of their folks for my thesis. And he said, it's too bad that you're graduating later this year because the job opening is now. And I thought to myself, well, here's a chance to kill two birds with one stone. I can leave, work for Berlitz, get some experience, maybe have a job after school, and I can take extra time to finish my thesis. So I told my advisor this in a meeting, and he flipped out. And in effect, he said, you're just going to cop out, you're going to quit? Okay, well, great. Because this is another, you talk about perverse incentives. He wanted to publish some of the work that I was doing, or at least present it. And I was his unpaid intern, and by delaying my graduation, I was screwing up that plan. At least that's what I assumed to be the case. And he got really furious, and he said, if you're going to take this time off, which I had to because the thesis wasn't going to get done otherwise, this better be the best thesis I've ever seen in my life. And in effect saying, I'm going to tank.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. And I knew it wasn't going to be the best. And he was effectively saying, I'm going to tank you if you leave. And so I felt like I was between a rock and a hard place. Went to the administration. I think this is when things started to take a turn even for the worse. I went to the administration because Princeton talks a lot about undergrads first. We focused all of our energy on the undergrads. Went to the administration to a few different folks, and their collective response was he wouldn't do that. Now, the power dynamics at an institution like that are really wonky, and people generally don't like to pick fights with tenured professors. It's a bad idea because they have an immunity bracelet. So I felt completely abandoned and deceived by the university, and ultimately decided to take the year off because I didn't feel like I had a choice. And Berlitz informed me that I would be not working at the main office, which I thought I would be doing. I would be working remotely from my home. And that is not a good thing. If you're trapped in your head, to then be trapped in a house by yourself, because I had two roommates who had just graduated from Princeton and were going about their normal 9 to 5. So they would leave and I'd be stuck in this house by myself looking at hundreds of pages on the floor. And very quickly figured out that the thesis just wasn't going to work the way that my advisor wanted me to put it together. And I started to panic. I started to spiral out and tell myself these stories such as I've wasted my parents' money. They and my extended family had all pitched together, and I got some scholarships, but not much, to get me to Princeton, and I'm going to get tanked for the senior thesis, and I've wasted all of their money. I'm a disappointment, and if I somehow contributed to ending up in this situation, I'm a failure anyway. I'm not going to succeed. Why would I want to be a burden to other people? And that type of thinking just got darker and darker and darker to the point where I was walking through a Barnes & Noble, just really stumbling around, not doing anything in particular. I think I was getting a coffee and I wandered in, and on one of the tables was displayed a book about suicide. And I thought, well, I've been looking for a miracle. Maybe this is the miracle. And I picked up the book and I read it. And for the first time in weeks, I was really excited because I felt like I'd found the answer. I was like, okay, well, coincidence or not, circumstances have conspired to bring me to find this book. Maybe
so this book is about not how to prevent suicide, but how to do your own suicide. Is that what
it was a book about, at the time,
do it yourself suicide kit?
It was in the self-help section.
They sell that at Barnes & Noble?
Oh, actually, no, it was in the self-hurt section. You may have seen the self-hurt section at the bookstore. So yeah, this was a book about Kevorkian and how they performed assisted suicides and things like that. So I went to the bibliography and I found all these books. And I was voracious. I finally found something that I was excited about because I felt like I knew what to do. And I went to Firestone Library at Princeton University and I requested a book that I couldn't find, which was on suicide, and it was out. I was like, well, that's a high pressure academic institution for you. Like somebody else is reading it and has the same idea. Hope he brings it back.
There's a waiting list. Yeah, right.
Yeah, there's a waiting list. I was like, well, I hope he brings the book back. And ultimately, it was just sheer chance that saved me. I had not updated my mailing address with the registrar. So the mailing address was not going to where I was staying right outside of Princeton. It went to my home address where my parents were.
Oh,
and
my God.
So a letter arrived at my parents' house that said, "Hi, Tim Ferriss. Good news. Your book on how to kill yourself just arrived at the Firestone Library."
Every mother's dream.
And so I got a very nervous phone call from my mom, and I tap danced around it. I was pretty quick on my feet, and I was like, "Oh no, that's not for me. You don't have to worry about anything. There's a friend of mine at Rutgers who doesn't have access to a library like Firestone. I was just getting it for him, blah, blah, blah." But I realized that shocked me out of my delusion, and I just realized suicide is like taking 10 times the pain that you feel and inflicting it on all the people you care about most.
Exactly
And
right. I always say a person commits suicide is literally the most self-obsessed of all, right? They're not caring about anybody but themselves. They're not thinking about the impact. It's so wonderful this snapped you out of it.
Yeah, so just, I mean, 1 in a million, right? Pure luck. I was saved from it. I mean,
Or guidance, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, or guidance. Like, to be clear though, like I had plans laid out. Everything was set to go. Like it was just a matter of setting a date, basically. And it was at that point that I, through a number of different, well, let's see, what did I do? First, I decided, well, if mind over body isn't working, maybe I can use body over mind. And so I made it a real point to focus on athletic training with a goal. So not just exercising, but training. And it just so happened that one of my friends was going to be competing in the national Chinese kickboxing championships a few months later. And as a joke, he asked me if I wanted to join him. And I was like, actually, yeah, I think I would. And so I started going to this really, really dirty, tiny boxing gym in Trenton, which is not a great place. I was the only guy not on work release, for instance, training at the gym. And I trained my ass off, and I made the focus getting out of my own head and into my body. That was a big part of it. And with the shock to the system that was this conversation with my mom, I started doing something that I would end up doing a lot more later, and I still do, but I mean, I call it fear setting, but in effect, writing down what I'm considering doing, which at the time was like, you know what, if I'm going to take a year off, like let me take a year off of the thesis, or take at least a few months of not even looking at it, just being done with it. And I made a column of all the worst things that could happen if I did that, bullet by bullet. And then the next column was for each of those, what I could do to minimize the likelihood of each of those happening. Then the last column was, if each of these happens, what can I do to get back to where I am now as quickly as possible? And after doing that exercise, I realized it's this whole story, or collection of stories that I'd collected and underlined and bolded and exaggerated for myself, were just nonsense. They were complete nonsense. And I also felt very alone. And in doing research after this, just wondering what the numbers looked like. I mean, suicide is a huge problem at these schools, and it's a huge problem.
It's a growing problem as well, unfortunately.
It's a growing problem, and these people feel like they're alone, just as I did. I felt like I was this fatally flawed creature, like the one defect from the factory, and everybody else had it kind of figured out. And why couldn't I figure it out? And that's my reason for putting this chapter in the book, is to also, of course, give different hotline options and coping mechanisms and strategies that I've used, because you don't just, at least in my case, I don't just come out of the dark and then it's all kittens and rainbows for the rest of my life. I mean, I sometimes get revisited by the storm, and I'm not necessarily suicidal, but I have just darker or more melancholic periods. And so there's a portfolio of techniques you can use to cope with that. And I wanted to include this chapter. I think it's the most important thing I've ever written, quite frankly, because
Beautiful.
These people are not alone. You're not alone if you feel that way. And it is reversible. It is, you can train yourself to ride those waves. And that's how it came to be.
I'm really grateful for you to share this, because I think so many people, when they see an individual of your caliber and all that you've mastered in your life, they think that it just came to you just naturally and normally and easily. And, what it really is the ability to take the dark thoughts that everyone has and put them aside, because there's something that you're focused on larger than yourself. And, you and I share so much in common. I mean, I was the run to the litter as well. I was obsessed with books, as you well know. We've shared that over the years. But what really changed me when I was not suicidal, but I certainly had my edges of where I just thought life was over, where I felt humiliated, where I felt like, I had made the biggest mistakes humanly possible. But, the big thing for me was radical changes in my physiology, the same as you, that instead of trying to change the mind, I changed my body, and my God, it shifted everything. You know my story. It's like going on this run when I hadn't run for 3.5 years, listening to this old rock group, playing this song called Barracuda and running as hard as I could. I was going to throw up. With my little Walkman on the beach, or my giant Walkman on the beach. But then the same thing, sitting down and getting clear about consequences. I think these are universal. Now, you said something in your book that I thought was really interesting, and I love this about you, Tim. You talked about, hey, we're all flawed creatures. We're all imperfect. And that the most successful people usually maximize one or two strengths. What would you say are the top strengths you've maximized that have made your life so much different than it was back in those dark days?
I think that... there are a few things. One is they're all related to asking questions. And what I've realized is studying questions and improving questions is improving your thinking. And I owe you for one that I think of often, which is the quality of your life is determined by the quality of your questions. It's so true. I think I've become better at asking a handful of questions. So one is, what's the worst that could happen?
That's a great question.
But going through the exercise that I described, and then the other is, what are the assumptions and how can I test them? Like, if I'm stuck or I feel like I've hit a ceiling doing something, like, what are my assumptions right now, including what are the stories I'm telling myself? And how can I stress test them? How can I try to break them? And along with that comes another question. And of course, there are many questions, but very frequently, if I'm not sure of what to do, I'll just ask myself, all right, in X, with the way I'm making cold phone calls back in the day, my first job out of school was smiling and dialing, man. Oh, what a tough job that was. But that's just thankless job. But
truly thankless.
And I would ask myself, what if I did the opposite? Just for 24 or 48 hours, what if I did the opposite? So for instance, I noticed all the other sales guys were calling between 9 and 5. That was just how you did it. But who's also working 9 to 5? All of the gatekeepers, all of the secretaries, all of the front desks. But if I asked, what if I did the opposite for the next 48 hours? There's nothing to lose. I'm not getting great results as it is. So I started making my phone calls early in the morning and then after, say, 5:30, 6 o'clock. And it was amazing, these big companies, how frequently the presidents or the CEOs would pick up the phone. And so I started booking the most meetings and closing the most deals. What if I did the opposite just for 24, 48 hours is something that I ask myself often. So I think in terms of my strengths, one is just asking questions. And very frequently they're absurd questions. As for instance, somebody who's been in the news a lot recently, but Peter Thiel, who's first investor in Facebook, just an incredible serial billionaire, very, very smart guy. I've spent some time with him, and he's in Tools of Titans. He will ask questions of himself and other people, such as, why can't you accomplish your 10-year plan in the next 6 months? And you and I both know, Tony, you're a master at this. When you ask yourself these types of absurd but powerful questions, it productively breaks the framework and the lens and everything that you've been using to try to solve problems up to that point, because they're incompatible. You just can't apply your incremental thinking to something like that. We're both friends with Peter Diamandis, who's chairman of the X Prize, also in the book, and he will ask, when founders of tech companies are hoping to get his investment, he'll ask them, if you had to 10x the economics of your business in the next, say, 6 months, how would you do it? And if they say that's impossible, and you'd have to meet Peter quite, and you have, like, the guy's a force of nature.
I love him.
Like, that's impossible. Saying that to Peter is
Wrong
just
guy.
not wrong answer. So his response is, I do not accept your answer. Try again. And I think the strength is asking questions, and the great part about that strength is that it is a coachable, learnable, practicable skill. It's something that you work at and you can get better at very, very quickly. The second skill, I think, would be pattern recognition, honestly. I wish I had a more sophisticated way to explain it, but I just intrinsically seem to be very good at pattern matching and pattern recognition. Yes. Even though I thought I was bad at languages for a very long time, once I had a proper teacher and then spent my first time abroad, which was in Japan, which was crazy. But I realized, looking at Japanese characters, for instance, like, I'm actually, if I believe I am good at pattern recognition, instead of negating all of it by saying this lie to myself, I'm bad at languages, I'm bad at languages, I'm bad at languages, where I see nothing but problems instead of opportunities. When I started saying, well, what if I were good at pattern recognition? Maybe I am good at pattern recognition. And that opened my eyes to that ability with Japanese and Chinese characters. And I've been able to harness that as I've slowly convinced myself that I might actually be good at it.
Well, your 2 points are so important, I think, for anybody, because, first of all, questions are the answers. You and I will know. Better question, better answer. What's wrong with me? Your brain's going to come up with tons of things. Why can't I do this? Because you're an idiot, right? But if you ask a better question, you get a better answer. And the most outrageous questions you said often give you the most outrageous answers. But I think it's also asking those questions with certainty. It's not just asking the question. You don't just ask a question in a general way. I know you quite well, Tim. You ask it in an obsessive way. You expect an answer. And I think it's important that people get that. But I also think if you look at that pattern recognition capability, that's what makes anyone the best in the world at what they do, right? It's their ability to recognize patterns and, more importantly, utilize them. And I think a skill you and I share is then create patterns, like to pull from, if you're going to play the piano, you start by learning other people's patterns. But once you learn enough other people's patterns, there's this internal synthesis, as you know, that occurs where now you bring you to it and you're able to create something that never existed before, standing on the shoulders of those you've learned from. So I think those two are absolutely critical. Tell me about the book now. Tell me, you hadn't written a book for 5 years. I didn't write one for 20 years at one point. It's not my favorite experience. What I was thrilled to hear when you and I talked was that you started enjoying writing this book. Tell me, why'd you write this book? What's different about this than 4-Hour Work Week, than 4-Hour Body, etc., 4-Hour Chef? And how did you enjoy this one so much more? What was the difference in the process for you, Tim?
I was not intending at all on writing a book. So I had given up on books, basically. After the 4-Hour Chef, I was so bloodied and battered and just tired of writing. Just so tired of writing. And keep in mind, just for comedic effect, I after my whole experience with the senior thesis in college, I had vowed to myself never to write anything longer than an email ever again. So you can see how well that worked out. These books you can use like kettlebells or doorstops for self-defense, but I was not planning on writing a book. I didn't want to write a book, and that's how the podcast started. The Tim Ferriss Show started because I wanted to try something loose. I wanted to try something I controlled completely, where I could just basically goof off and have fun and try to get better at asking questions. And the book ended up becoming a book, in this case, Tools of Titans, because I'd set aside an entire month. My mother had never been to Paris. My dad hadn't been since the 60s. And I wanted to take them to see the July 15th, basically the 4th of July, fireworks, the Eiffel Tower, and so on. Life is short. And by the time you're out of high school or out of college, you've spent basically 80+% of the hours that you'll ever spend with your parents. So it's the tail end. And so I took them there, and I set aside the entire month for one thing. And this was to go through all of my notes. And I've seen your notebooks. This is a cheat, by the way, that I use too. Write it down. It sounds silly, but the way that I've been able to spot a lot of the most powerful patterns is by having notebooks and writing these things down. When someone like Peter Thiel asks me, why can't you achieve your 10-year plan in the next 6 months? I don't just think about it for 20 seconds and then move on to my next latte. I write that down, and then I'll sit down for an hour and maybe have a glass or two of wine to loosen things up, and I'll freehand, and I'll really think about it, but I'll think about it on paper.
Yes.
And so
You
what
and
I
me
want
both
to
on
do,
that one.
I gotta interject here because Tony does not think about it on paper. Yes, he has an impressive stack of moleskins. Room of journals from ages and ages. But Tim, this guy goes crazy. I mean, if he hears a question that gets him going, it's like nothing is safe. No mirror, no tablecloth. I'll open drawers. There's Sharpies scribbled in kitchen cabinets. I'm like, dude, come on. What am I supposed to tell your wife? Keep it in a note. Keep a journal handy.
I believe it. You know, the worst is when I write something that I think is really important on my hand, and then I go to a restaurant. I'm like, no, this is important. It's on my hand. And then I wash my hand, and I'm like, oh my God, I lost 2 words. What did it say? But so I write all this stuff down. So I had just thousands of pages of notes from all these interviews, and I had also hundreds and thousands of pages of notes, 10,000 plus pages for transcripts. But I had notes on advice that these guests had given me after the podcast or outside of the podcast. I had all this stuff, and I wanted to put together for myself the ultimate notebook, like the notebook to end all notebooks, the cliff notes of all of these performers, because I felt anxious when I would do, say, 2 interviews or 3 interviews in a week, and I wouldn't have time to absorb and test some of this stuff. And I wanted to test all of it because I'm a crazy person. And that is what I proceeded to do. So I'd set aside a month just for myself, not for anybody, to put together this cliff notes, this cheat sheet to the habits and routines and favorite books and favorite documentaries and so on of all these incredible people. And when I got about halfway through it and putting it together, no book deal, no nothing. This is just for me. I realized, good God, I mean, this is exactly what my listeners and readers have been asking me for. And the way that I mean that is, what do I get asked all the time? I get asked, if you were to rewrite the 4-Hour Workweek, what would you change? What would you add to it? Are you ever going to write a follow-up? The 4-Hour Body, what's changed? What would you add to it? What would be different? 4-Hour Chef, same thing. And the Tools of Titans answers all of that. It's basically the sequel to all 3 books, because it's broken into healthy, wealthy, and wise. So healthy, it's all the stuff that I would have put into a new edition of the 4-Hour Body. Wealthy, it's all the stuff basically that I would have put into a new edition of the 4-Hour Workweek, maybe minus case studies. Then wise, I mean, 4-Hour Chef being a book about accelerated learning, same story. And the reason that I decided to turn it into a book also is that I feel like some of my message has been misinterpreted by a small percentage of my followers or readers. And quite frankly, I don't blame them, because I think I've changed myself over the last 5 years quite a lot. And specifically,
I wanted to ask you, Tim, I'm going to point you in one direction, because I love how I read your blog, I listen to the podcast, and I love how open you are actually about, I mean, it's tough when you have your whole life kind of between blog and a podcast. You're out there. So it's tough being a guy with insecurities, I think, too. Honest insecurities about, like, basically, I love this note about your editor being human. Yeah. You know, having somebody proof your work. And I know even when Tony's writing a book, it's like, it's gold, Tone. But still, it's like, I can feel it in you. I can feel it in both of you guys. Like, hey, did I do something? Or is it all here? Also, is there stuff that you look back on, a blog post or even things in previous books that makes you feel like, that makes you cringe, or that makes you at least wonder, who wrote that? Like, am I the same guy? Because with all these years of interviews comes growth, comes transformation. Is there stuff you look back on and you're like, whoa, I was a different dude back then? Or no?
Oh, yeah. There's a ton of it. And I think that up to this point, or not this point, but up until a few years ago, I was really focused on goal achievement and just accumulating trophies and titles, and not in a prideful way necessarily, but I was very focused on the optimizing of goal achievement, period, and end of story. And we could call that success. Let's just call that what most people would envision as success. But I've come to realize that if you focus solely on achievement and not appreciation, not gratitude, you never feel fulfilled. You never feel content because you're so fixated on the future, as you have to be if you're just planning for the next thing. You actually have a very anxiety-infused existence. There's a constant low-grade anxiety being trapped in the future tense. And in the last 5 years, and I mean, we could get into it. Certainly, I've had some supervised experiences with, let's call it plant medicine, that I write about in the book with the help of a number of doctors. But I've also observed a number of tragedies in my life. I've had friends. I'm at an age now where people are dying, and sometimes it's natural causes. Sometimes, super sad story. A friend of mine was with his newlywed, and they were climbing Kilimanjaro, and a rock came tumbling down, hit him in the head, dead on the spot. And I've realized that you're not guaranteed a long life on this planet, and for that reason, you don't want to wait to redeem things later. It doesn't work, A, but B, you're not guaranteed to get there. So for me, I've really tried to cultivate practices and processes and habits to cultivate enjoying and appreciating what I have now. Because if I can't do that, nothing I ever get will make me feel happy. And I've realized that it's not like appreciation is 90% of it, and that achievement is 90% of it, and appreciation is like, yeah, you need it, but it's like 10%, and then you're fine. You're good to go. No. It's at least 50-50.
And my experience in the last couple of years, and you and I have talked about it, is success without fulfillment's the ultimate failure. You know, how many guys do you and I know that we've interviewed that have genius in so many areas, have added so much value to so many people? You know, it's the Robin Williams metaphor, right? Made everybody happy except himself. And so, I would argue that it's more than 50%. I think our culture, especially for those who've had achievement upbringing at some level, or their upbringing was a difficult upbringing and they went for achievement as a way to pull themselves out of it, that our culture reinforces achievement as being much more important than fulfillment, which is really just appreciation, which is really just gratitude. And you and I both know without that, there's nothing. The two emotions that dominate people's lives, the majority, and create havoc in their lives and their relationships, their business, is feeling angry. That's number one. And you can't be angry and grateful simultaneously. And the other one is fear, being fearful. And when you're fearful, you almost always make the wrong decision. And you can't be grateful and fearful simultaneously. So I think this process that I've seen it in you too, and I'm not with you every day, but you can hear it in you, you can feel in you. It's something that is a friend of yours that I'm so thrilled to see you have, and it's something that I'm doing in my own life as well. And I hope our listeners, hearing from both of us as crazy-ass overachievers that want to know the answer to everything now, that to realize that there's got to be a segment of your life where you linger a little bit, where you take in a little bit, where you stop and you taste life, not just keep pursuing the next thing. And that's not stopping and just sitting at the table of success too long so you're bored or you're not growing. It's just that delicate balance that you seem to be finding in your life right now.
Yeah, it absolutely. And you mentioned Robin Williams. I remember very, very specifically when Robin Williams died. I mean, he's a San Francisco native, effectively. I spend most of my time in San Francisco, and I was with my girlfriend at the time, and I kind of freaked her out. But I was like, look, you don't have to worry about me. But when he died, I remember thinking, and this is going to sound weird maybe to some people, but I was like, I get it. Like people were just completely dumbfounded. How could this happen? This is just crazy. I can't even conceive of how this is possible. And I was like, I get it. Like I've been in that weird, like demonic Alice in Wonderland mindset where like everything good looks bad. Everything you do looks like a weakness. I mean, I've been in that delusional state. And I think that in large part it stems, especially if you're predisposed to a sole focus on achievement. That is just a recipe for disaster. And for me, what's been a revelation is realizing that gratitude, appreciation, they sound like woo-woo stuff that you have to go to Northern California to like dive into. You need like a didgeridoo and some crystals. It's like, no. if you find all of that and even those words really unpalatable, right, as a type A driven personality, which I did for a long time, I was like, are you kidding me? Like meditation? Are you kidding me? Like, no, we could talk about that. But
yeah, but 80% of the people that you've interviewed, the 200 people that are the most influential icons, billionaires, don't they all have some form of meditation they do?
They have some form of meditation or mindfulness.
Yeah.
And I would consider your state priming mindfulness by my definition, which is putting yourself in a state where you become more aware of your thoughts and your emotional state so that you can steer both of them in a particular direction. I think that is something that at least 80% of the people I've interviewed do. And these are hard charging folks. I mean, these are not, these are not all kind of namaste yoga teacher. I'm going to take the next 10 months off. And look, I love yoga, a lot of yoga. I'm really into something called acro yoga. But the point being that if you're type A and driven, you can view certain practices such as mindfulness, meditation, whether that's listening to one track on repeat, which a lot of people like coders and rock climbers do, as I talk about in the book, this repetition of tracks.
Yes.
For zone, which is kind of like a mantra that you just make external. It's very interesting. There are folks who will view that piece, the practice of gratitude, and that could be using something like the 5-minute journal in the morning when you just write down, I am grateful for bullet, 3 things. That's it. Is recovery. And this is kind of a hard, it's a different way to frame it for people who are like I'm all about success. I don't need that crap. That's for weak people. You can think of these periods where you shift gears to appreciation, gratitude, mindfulness, breath, changing your physiology through cold exposure, whatever it might be, as recovery, and treat your brain like you would treat your body. No ultra endurance runner is going to run 24 hours a day. It doesn't work because you need to recover and then you get stronger. Yeah. And similarly with the exactly. And with the brain, it's no different. You have a limited supply of physical substrates like neurotransmitters. And if you're burning the candle at both ends, you need recovery periods so that you can then get stronger, just as you would in the gym. And these serve that purpose. So you end up being more capable of achieving and success when you take some time to dedicate to practices like these. It's not a subtraction, it's an addition or a multiplication.
Tell me, of all the people that you've interviewed, and I get asked this question all the time as well, obviously we have a diverse world you and I have entered into and that we've pursued. Who are 2 or 3 that maybe surprised you the most? Like you learned things from that in a way different than you expected, and what are some of the most unusual patterns that you found around wealth or health or wisdom that you want people to really grab out of this book? What are some of the ones that stand out for you? One thing that you shared with me earlier was that you've had so many different friends read the book and they all come up with, what's their top 10%. It's different for everybody. But I'm talking about for you. Who are the 2 or 3 that surprised you the most? What'd you pull from them? And what are a couple of the patterns that really for you have been in that top 10%, that they've become a part of your life in some way?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in reverse order just because the latter jumps to mind immediately. And this also corrects another common misconception. So, the vast majority, I mean 90% plus of the people in the book get 8 to 10 hours of sleep per night. And they prioritize sleep or have learned to prioritize sleep. And these are sometimes people who grew up going for the gold with 4 hours, 6 hours, or closer to 4. Now, I should also just note in a second, because I'm going to make some particular recommendations, but for every possible pattern in this book, there is someone who does the opposite. And I find that really reassuring because it means you don't have to wake up at 4:30 in the morning like Jocko Willink necessarily. There are a lot of early risers. Yeah, there are a lot of early risers, but you don't have to be a Navy SEAL commander.
I'm a go to bed at 4:30 kind of guy.
Yeah,
Tony just hung up on you.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So thank God there are a couple of people in the book who are like, what? I'm not even coherent until 11 a.m. And then I go to sleep at 4. I'm like, oh, whew, thank God I have an out. But the sleep is a consistent pattern, and they'll use a number of devices popped up a lot, and I'd never heard of them before I was told of them. So Rick Rubin, legendary music producer, as well as Kelly Starrett, CrossFit training superstar, among other things, and a bunch of seemingly unrelated folks recommended something called the chili pad, for instance. And this chili pad is a thin sheet that you put under your own sheet on your side of the bed if you're sharing it with someone, and it solves the two people running at two different temperature problem with like tearing off blankets and changing who wants to open the window, close the window, all that goes away. But you can then set your temperature of your bed to anywhere between 55 degrees and I want to say 85. And you find your ideal sleep temperature. And this has been a complete game changer. I have one now, and it is just an incredible tool. You don't realize what good sleep is oftentimes until you get this temperature variable right. Other folks have had these weird cocktails. For instance, Dr. Seth Roberts, the late, great Seth Roberts, PhD from Berkeley, he did a lot of self-experimentation, and he figured out this cocktail that now thousands of my fans have used, and I'll just tell you what it is. It is a pre-bed cocktail for those people who have insomnia or just want to get to bed and have a solid night's sleep. It is 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. I use the Dr. Bragg stuff with the mother and so on that you get at any Whole Foods or wherever. Then a tablespoon of raw honey dissolved into hot water, and that's it. You just drink that. Now, I have theories, but I do not have a good explanation for why this works. Yet I have had hundreds of my fans say, I've tried everything, nothing has worked. This stuff knocked me out like an elephant tranquilizer dart.
Wow.
And, yeah. So
Cohen's getting one of those tonight. I'm making it myself.
Yeah. So go figure, right? In terms of surprising folks, and there are a bunch of odd patterns, like the listening to music, one track on repeat over and over and over again. If they're trying to focus or get into flow, that's super consistent. And so I provide I have a 2 pages called the Soundtrack of Excellence, where I just share the music that these people play on repeat. It's pretty wild.
That's really wild.
That's a weird one.
I wrote Unlimited Power to the same track over and over again.
Oh, no kidding. Was it Barracuda or was it something else?
What was it?
No, it was Elton John's, what's the one, with Norma Jean. over and over and over.
Oh, nice.
I know, what a bizarre thing. I was 24. I don't know what the hell was going on. I think in those days you had a CD player and it got stuck, so I just let it go. I don't know, it's unconscious. But anyway, continue.
So one of the guests who really surprised me was a palliative care physician named B.J. Miller. That means, for those people who don't know, I didn't know, he helps people die. He is a hospice physician, and he's very credible. He's affiliated with UCSF, but he also ran something called the Yeah, he's incredible. And he runs something called the Zen Hospice Project, or did at the time, based in the Bay Area. Now, he has some history that I knew quite a bit about, because he also went to Princeton a few years before me. He and his buddies were coming home from a late night, and there's a tiny little commuter train that's nicknamed the Dinky on Princeton University campus that then takes you to Princeton Junction. And it always looks off if it's not in use. But he climbed up on top of it just as a joke with his buddies, and he had a big watch on, and he was electrocuted, and it burned off 3 of his limbs. So he's a triple amputee. And in this conversation, I asked him a million questions, but what surprised me, there were many things that surprised me. He had some great answers to certain questions. Like, I asked just about everybody, what would you put on a gigantic billboard, a short message if you want, or a word, anything that you wanted to convey to millions of people? And he said, don't believe everything that you think. And I was like, ooh,
yeah, that
is a good one. And he also, I'm not going to say contradicted, but he told me in practical environments where he's helped 1,000 people to die, that what we read in these lists that every year seem to appear, like the top 8 regrets of the dying and stuff like that, that you tend to hear what you would expect, right? They're like, well, I'm glad I spent all my time with family, and I would never say that I regretted spending less time in the office. And it's always the same 5 or 6 things. And when I asked him what he would do, for instance, or if he were to give 2 or 3 things to someone in his hospice facility who didn't want to interact with others, to help them through their transition, what would he do? And he named some music, this, that, and the other thing, but one was a book of Mark Rothko paintings. And I asked him why. And for those people who haven't seen the art, it's abstract, it's colored.
Oh my gosh.
Squares.
Yes. It's big orange squares, red squares.
Big orange squares.
$50 million, $80 million.
Yeah, $50 million. And I asked him why, and he said, because when you're going through, and I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but when you're going through a transition to death and you're terminal, the instinct is to try to find a why. What is the reason? Why is this happening to me? What is the purpose? What is the reason? And he's actually found it's extremely therapeutically valuable for people to ponder the beauty of purposelessness. So this is interesting, right?
Wow, it's very different.
So he wants people to learn to appreciate the aesthetic beauty and profundity of meaninglessness, of purposelessness, that it's not necessarily a bad thing, even though our modern society often thinks of it that way, that can be extremely beautiful, and the serendipity involved and so on can be magical in a sense in and of itself. And I was also asking what tends to bring people out of funks if they were in a depressive period because they knew they were going to die. And his answers were all the small things. He said, for instance, baking cookies together was his go-to. Baking cookies together was the number one, or at least one of the top, because you don't have a cookie on behalf of anything else. It is not, there is no future tense. You enjoy a cookie in the presence period, the smells, the sounds of the kitchen, the taste for the present period, full stop. And that was also very thought-provoking for me. He does something, and this is one of those patterns when I was writing Tools of Titans that I spotted, and I was like, oh my God, that's so crazy that these two guys separated across oceans, completely unrelated. Ed Cook, who's a memory champion, he can memorize a shuffled deck of cards in like 40 seconds. He's incredible.
Wow.
And then and he's trained other people to do that, which is even crazier. Then you have BJ Miller, and they both do something that I ended up calling for myself star therapy. And I still do this every night that I can. And what BJ would do is each night when he was feeling anxious or overwhelmed or you name it, whatever it is, upset, angry, he would look up at the stars and he would just ponder and consider how the light hitting his eye could be thousands of years old. And perhaps the stars that he's seeing don't even exist anymore. And he has a handful of other guidelines for it that he uses for himself. But when you start to ponder the enormity, just the grand scale of the universe as we know it, which may not even be the whole picture, right? Then when the fact that you're pissed off because someone cut you off in the salad line just becomes laughably ridiculous, you know, or the fact that like, oh my God, I'm so pissed because this guy canceled a meeting on me last minute. It just sounds so childish and trivial and ridiculous that you were able to get past it. And I found it incredibly effective. And trust me, like I am a by the numbers, calculating type A, placebo-controlled, double-blind, all of that. Like I am a maniac for that stuff. And so I would, if my like 20-year-old self could hear me talking about star therapy, it'd just vomit into his, onto his shoes. But I'm here to tell the younger me and everybody else, like it's incredibly effective. And the fact that it occurs twice, Ed Cook does something very similar in a relatively small sample size, right? 200 of these world-class performers in disparate areas from different cultures. That is a gingerbread trail worth following and investigating. And there's a lot of that.
Tell me something, because I know we're going to run out of time on your interview. I want to touch on one more. You've given us some great wisdom. This is Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise in this book in terms of chunking. Give us something on the wealthy side. I know you've very smartly invested in Uber and Facebook early on. How'd that come about? Is there proximity to that? And what would be a wealth insider, too, that would grab somebody's attention? Because my goal is to have them listen and immediately, you go pick up this book for the cliff notes of 200 interviews by itself. My God, this is truly the master's work that all of you get a chance to listen to. But how about one in the area of wealth as well?
Yeah, I'll give a couple of quick ones. So the first is pick a game that you can win. And what I mean by that is, for instance, if you look at, and a lot of these top financiers and hedge fund managers and wealth managers, you need an advantage, or at least you need to not have a disadvantage. And what I mean by that is you can have an analytical advantage. You can have an informational advantage, which I had with startups living in San Francisco. I could engineer my circumstances so that I was in the middle of the switch box, basically. You can have a behavioral advantage. For instance, if you look at Warren Buffett, people are like, I can do everything that Warren Buffett does. It's not that hard. And I'm like, well, Warren Buffett is able to be emotional and not respond to swings in the market. He is not subject to Mr. Market. And I remember hearing this story. I don't know if it's true, but it was written in his biography about how he would come home every day after work, walk up the stairs, sit down and read annual reports and so on, or filings. And at one point, he came home, walked up the stairs. His son, I think, was splayed out like a ski accident on the stairs, like, oh, and he stepped over his son, walked up the stairs, sat down, started reading his reports. And then he came back like 5 minutes later and he's like, are you okay? But he's very Spock-like. That is a behavioral advantage. And
he's also put a structural advantage in that's good for people to remember too, because I'm writing another book myself right now called Unbreakable. And if you're a great pilot and you know everything about flying, you still have a checklist because it's just too important. And you have a co-pilot usually who has a checklist, and just in case you screw up, if it's that important a flight, you've got passengers. And Charlie Munger is that other balance for him. He's put that person who's kind of attacks his ideas. Same thing with Ray. If you look at Bridgewater, and you see here's the largest hedge fund on the face of the planet, 165 billion in assets, when a big hedge fund might be 16 billion. He's 10 times bigger. And you watch what Ray's done, and he's set up 1,800 employees to kind of attack his best ideas to make sure it's there. So it's having that balance outside of themselves besides the emotion that's so critical.
Totally. And so just because you mentioned it, what Ray does inside Bridgewater is very similar to what Mark Andreessen, who's basically a serial billionaire, and a co-author of the first popular graphical web browser. So if you use a browser on a computer, you are experiencing the influence of Mark Andreessen. He will also practice what Ray does, and he calls it red teaming, which is also used in the military. So Stan McChrystal, retired 4-star general, also talks about this, where you will take a portion of your team, and their job as the red team is to attack your ideas or attack your position or attack your defenses. So if you have a big company or you just have a business plan, get some of your friends. Their job, you're the blue team, they're the red team. Their job is to destroy your company. And if people have bigger companies, you should take the scrappiest 20-year-olds in your company, and this is actually Peter Diamandis' advice, and have them red team how to disrupt and take out your company. But other advice that I think is really helpful, and actually this is in your profile actually because I thought it was so genius, is related to your observation that these icons, these incredible success stories, Richard Branson, who has a very, very Indiana Jones-like image, of course. You look at some of these folks like Carl Bass, these incredible billionaires, and if you look at how they talk versus how, say, financially unsuccessful people talk, very financially unsuccessful or dissatisfied people will often say things like, you need to spend money to make money, man. Like nothing ventured, nothing gained. You got to risk big to make it big. And if you look at any of the people I just named, as well as a lot of people in this book, they are always capping the downside. They are always minimizing the risk. And the first thing they look at is like, okay, we're going to start an airline in the case of Richard Branson. All right, let me figure out how to call up Boeing and negotiate a lease so that I can return this damn thing if it doesn't work out. And the same is true with my startup investing. I'm constantly capping the downside. What is the maximum that I can lose? Can I afford to lose it? How can I basically go through the fear setting exercise when looking at these things. So that's really, I think, a key observation. And then another one is, don't be afraid to try what you're not qualified to do. and I'll give you an example. Chris Sacca, who I watched go from making this up, but probably $100,000 a year to now being a billionaire. I've been friends with him the whole time. I watched it happen. And when he was at Google, he's an incredible investor now and has a bunch of funds and so on. But he will probably have the most successful venture capital fund of all time, which is lowercase one, which I was lucky enough to be a part of. But when he was working at Google, this was one of his kind of first gigs out of college. Very smart guy, but Google was, I'm guessing, a few hundred people at the time. He would walk into any meeting with higher ups and just sit down and start taking notes. He was not invited to these meetings. Keep in mind, he would just show up, and the Wonder Twins, which is the nickname for Sergey and Larry, the co-founders of Google. And they'd kind of look at each other and be like, what the hell is this guy doing here? What are you doing here? And he'd say, oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't invited to this, but I thought I'd just take notes for you guys. Is that okay? And he actually he didn't pull it off every time, but he pulled it off enough that people just began to expect him to be there. So he learned how the entire business worked. And his learning, his exponential curve of learning was 100x, 1,000x all of his sort of cohort of colleagues who came in at the same time as those early hires. And that has been one of his game plans from day one. And Naval Ravikant, another guy in the book who's one of the most successful angel investors in the world, period, as well as entrepreneurs, he said to his brother once, who told me this, if I always did what I was qualified to do, I'd be pushing a broom somewhere. So if you can cap the downside, this is an important part of it, right? Like, I'm not suggesting like, oh, you're unqualified to do options trading. Yeah, try that and don't worry about it. No, like, cap the downside, figure out where you have an advantage ideally. But if you don't be afraid to test what you're unqualified to do, as long as you've answered the question, what's the worst that can happen? How can I get back to where I am if something goes sideways? Figure that stuff out. But that is one of the magic tricks of probably everyone in this book, I would say.
Well, the whole concept of asymmetrical risk reward, I think, is one of the single most important things I learned from these groups as well. It's how do I have the least amount of risk with the most upside? And if you can organize your life that way, because otherwise you're going for the grand slam home run and you're going to strike out and strike out and strike out. And that's what makes the difference, between the very best investors in the world. So tell me, for those listening, we're talking again, Tools of the Titans is the new book, The Tactics, Routines, and Habits of Billionaires, Icons, and the World-Class Performers by Tim Ferriss. Tim, Mary has another question for you.
Okay.
Yeah, Tim, I want to know, you just told us a little bit earlier in this interview that the podcast was really born out of your frustration or your general fed upness with writing. You said you were going to write an email again. We all know. Like you said, you write kettlebells just like Tony here. You guys, I mean, you can't write a book under 600 pages, I'm convinced. Neither of you. You're cut from the same cloth. So I just wonder, you're up to 200 episodes. Is the podcast, what does the future for Tim Ferriss look like? Is the podcast something you love to do?
You got your new TV show coming up as well. I'd like to hear about.
I do.
I'm sorry I couldn't do that in our timeline there.
No worries. There will probably be a season 2, I think. The podcast is something I absolutely love. It is my favorite part of book writing without the writing. And Tony, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Talking to experts and asking them all my questions and then not having to write a book about it. Oh my God. Now, of course, that didn't quite work out, but just as a funny side note. So I remember I was like, all right, I'm going to do a light book. This is going to be a short book. And I was like, what I'm going to do is just going to be great one-liners from all these guests. People will be able to read it in 45 minutes. It'll be one of those tiny little books at the checkout counter. It'll be great. And then I got into it. And of course, I see it and I'm like, are you kidding me? I can't rip these people off. Like, one quote, they're not even going to understand the context. It'll sound good, but like, oh God. All right, I'll make it a little bit longer. And yeah, here we are, 704 pages. But the podcast for sure, because I love doing it. I'll keep doing that. I have no plans to stop that. The TV show is another experiment. It's called Fear Less, with less in parentheses. And Vince Vaughn, the actor, director, producer, is a big fan of the podcast. So he reached out to me and his team reached out to me. And that will be coming out in May. We've already filmed the first season. It's going to be awesome. I had a bunch of incredible folks on, like David Blaine, and there's a long list. And what does the future hold in store for Tim Ferriss? Well, I will tell you, I've approached this a little bit differently, and I've changed how I look at the future in a lot of ways. So I used to try to spec out 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 20-year plans, you name it. These days, as long as I have decided on what my values are, and morally, for instance, what I will do, what I won't do, what I'll accept and what I won't accept, then I really focus on, generally speaking, 6 to 12 month projects and experiments where I do my absolute freaking best to put out something of value into the world. And then I wait to see which doors open, because what I've noticed is whenever I try to make a 5-year plan, for that 5-year plan or 10-year plan to be remotely reliable, I have to shoot below my 100%. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
like
sure.
if I'm swinging for the fences, I'm going to whiff some. I'm going to miss some. But if I want a reliable 5 to 10-year plan in detail, then I'm going to have to aim for, say, 80% of my capacity so that I don't have those foul balls. And I don't want to live that way. Number one, I'm happy to take the hard ball to the face every once in a while if I'm able to really go for it and enjoy the uncertainty in a way that comes with that, which is also something that you have to train yourself to get more comfortable with. The second part of that is that every time, like with the 4-hour work week, if I had tried to spec out like a 5-book 10-year plan for being the 4-hour work week email management guy, oh my God, like kill me now. Like, I'm so glad I didn't do that. I would have lost so much flexibility and adaptability and couldn't have even conceived of any of this stuff happening. I mean, even when I started the podcast, I couldn't have conceived of the possibility that I would be sitting here right now with a huge book about this podcast that I could not be happier with. I mean, this was such a joy for me to write. And talking to Tony Robbins as a friend who inspired me and guided me through books and personal power and beyond, starting in high school. I mean, this is just, for me, a dream come true. And if I had tried to plan based on my incomplete set of information and false assumptions and self-handicapping beliefs and all of that stuff at any point in the last 5, 10, 15 years, I wouldn't have had this wonderful experience. So for me, the short answer is I have no idea.
I love that.
I'm totally okay with it. I'm totally okay with that.
I look at my own life, and I can remember early in my life, my teens, my 20s, I was so obsessed with being precisely clear about what exactly my objective was. And same things happened for me over the years. What I learned as time came by is I know the mountain I'm heading towards, but whether I'm going to go over it, around it, through it, I'm going to stop and pause on it, all those things, keeping the flexibility of that opening is how life unfolds, as opposed to trying to control life. Because you can control life, like you say, but you're going to get a much smaller return than when you stay open to your own essence, the essence of life, the essence of guidance, and see what shows up. So tell me, just to finish up, because I know I'm gone past our time here, but I'm just curious, what do you, I think I have a good sense because I can see your friend, but what do you do? What makes you laugh out loud? What do you do for pure fun outside of learning and growing? What gives you joy outside of what most people know about Tim Ferriss?
What gives me joy? I really enjoy embarrassing myself on purpose. So I really have tried, and this is partially as a result of really learning from folks like BJ Miller, the hospice physician that we were talking about, is to really not just embrace the absurdity, but like enjoy the absurdity and sometimes create the absurdity. And I might go in, for instance, like if I'm just feeling wacky one day and I'm like, you know what? Today is a little boring. I need to spice things up and laugh more. I might just walk into a Starbucks and lay down on the floor for 10 minutes. And people will and they'll come over and they'll eventually someone will come over and I'll be like, no, I'm fine. I'm just resting. And I'll just wait and just look at the complete bewilderment and puzzlement around me. 10 minutes, I'm probably not going to make 10 minutes, but you could lay down for 20 seconds. That's perfectly sufficient to weird everybody out and do no one any harm, but to walk away and finding it incredibly hilarious. So that would be, something like that. Or I have absurd outfits. I have a white cowboy hat that I'll sometimes wear just to the airport. Just to see what happens. I'll wear a white cowboy hat on. And a white cowboy hat with flip-flops and walk around and just see these looks. Even in San Francisco, for God's sake, they're like, what the hell is this guy doing? I love that stuff. Or, I mean, this is maybe an easier way that people can experiment with this, but I'll put out just nonsensical stuff on Twitter or Facebook just to see how people respond. I mean, I'll put out things that could not possibly be taken literally by anyone. But of course, it's the internet, so it's taken literally by like 10% of the people out there. And
they all argue over what it means, right?
Oh yeah, they'll argue over what it means. And so really embracing the absurdity. And in fact, I've started reading a lot about mythology in different cultures as related to trickster gods. And trickster gods are interesting because they very often get themselves in trouble, but they're more often than not the bridge between the human realm or the animal realm and the deity godlike realm, the realm of the other. And they're the boundary walker. They have one foot in either side, and they sometimes have things blow up in their face, Wile E. Coyote style. That happens quite a bit. But they also, in some instances, say bring fire to humans or bring knowledge to humans or actually create. They're very often part of the creation myth in many of these mythologies. And I'm not at all saying that I'm close to a god. I mean, I'm a lesser human at best, often closer to an animal probably. But I do think there are lessons to be taken from that, and the just embracing the absurdity, embracing the uncertainty, and learning to surf those waves as opposed to resist them and try to mold everything in your reality to your will, which is it's a very, very futile exercise, and you don't have to live that way. And in fact, like you said, Tony, being open to the possibilities, to be open to possibilities and to seize those opportunities, you have to see clearly. So anything that I can do to help people to see more clearly, whether that's their own self-limiting beliefs or that what they think are their rules for life are actually rules they just absorbed from their parents without even realizing it, and they never question them, or some type of, say, meditation app that they can use in the morning for 10 minutes a day for 10 days to see what the effect is. That's for the time being, at least, that's, I think, why I'm here. So I am moving towards the mountain, like you said, but who knows, as I might get distracted and do some water skiing on the way there.
I love it. Last question. Who is Tim Ferriss, and what is his mission? What's the mission of this book? Tell us that to finish up, if you would. Who are you at your core?
Tim Ferriss is a very imperfect creature with a lot of curiosity and a high pain tolerance, who is willing to test the extremes so he can report back and help everyone who is not eager to push themselves to that self-incineration point. And my goal, my drive, my mission, all of that, if I had to think of it, this is the constant. It is that I want to create a benevolent army of hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are creative problem solvers, the best creative problem solvers the world has ever seen. And in turn, each of those people can teach 10, 100, 1,000 or more people to do exactly the same thing. That's what I'm trying to do.
I'll add my own criteria. I'd say a man with a gigantic heart as well. You left that part out. And somebody who's truly a blessing in millions of people's lives, including my own. So it's been a privilege to visit with you again, my dear friend. People, pick up Tools of the Titans. You can go to the www.toolsofthetitans.com and you get description and a sample chapter of the book, or you can get it on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, anywhere. It's out officially as of when?
It's out officially as of December 6th. So it is imminent, right around the corner.
Perfect.
And there's some folks who are already getting their books shipped, apparently. So it's available, and it is out. And I feel very, very comfortable recommending people check it out. I think it's my best work, and it was fun for me to write, and I think that makes it fun to read.
That's beautiful.
So I really appreciate the time, Tony and Mary, and you guys rock. This is always fun for me.
We love it personally, and I'm excited for so many people to take in the best of what you pulled out of those 200 interviews and the synthesis of it. It's an extraordinary gift to give everyone.
Thank you, Tony.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Tim. Can't wait to check out the book. I'll stop stalking your dog on Instagram. That's my Tim Ferriss favorite. But I look forward. I'm going to read your book. So there, I'll give your dog a rest.
I appreciate it. Molly, I'm sure would love to play with you.
I can't wait.
And
that's what I was hoping you'd say.
we will all hang soon, and I'll introduce you formally to my dear Papa Molly.
Thank you.
Okay. God bless, brother. Take good care of yourself.
Same to you. Happy holidays.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tim.
The Tony Robbins Podcast is directed and hosted by Tony Robbins and Mary Buckheit. Carrie Song is our executive producer. Strategy and distribution by Anna Jorg and Tyler Culbertson. Jamie Carvajal and Adriel De La Torre are our digital editors. Copyright Robbins Research International.